Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Jordan Grimes. I'm the Legislative Director here at Greenbelt Alliance. Want to start by just welcoming everyone to another session of our Common Ground program. This is for those of you who haven't been here before, a series designed to create thoughtful and sometimes challenging conversations between housing, environmental, and climate advocates. Um, this is, really something that um, a space that can help us better understand one another's priorities and really help to find pathways forward together. The Common Ground series is hosted through the Alliance for Housing and Climate Solutions, which Greenbelt is proud to co-sponsor with Prosperity California. We are a statewide collaboration of organizations committed to advancing housing affordability and climate resilience in California. We're really excited about today's session, an update on the state of public transit in California. Transit, as I think folks know, is a critical link really between where we build housing and how people get around that sits at the center of many of the debates that we all engage in. So with that, just to talk a little bit about what we'll be doing today. We'll be breaking folks into small groups just to get to know each other a little bit before we start to have these conversations. We'll pull folks back and then we'll have conversations with our panelists. So I'd like to pass things over to our facilitator, Ratna Amin, to explain a little bit more about how our session will go.
Thank you, Jordan. Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Can we jump ahead on the slides? Francis, next. Next. Okay, if you've been here before, you've heard this, but it's an important reset at the beginning of each common ground. I'm here to help facilitate and keep an eye on the overall group process that we're in common ground. A reminder that we're here to learn about each other. This is actually a gathering, it's not just a presentation, and learn about the intertwined challenges of housing and climate. And today we're bringing in the transportation element. We're taking a break from advocacy to focus on listening, inquiry, absorbing new information, or allowing for shifts to happen during the session. We are having dialogue, not debates, and we're not working out policy agendas during the session. If you have something technical to deal with, please take it to another time and place. I just want to remind everybody, especially today, what Laura and Victor are presenting is very in depth from the front lines of this fight. And many of you work on the front lines of a number of related issues. And I really encourage you to just let the depth come in, make space for some new information, a new way of looking at this, some new data during this session. So you leave with like some that in a way that you've absorbed it. Not just confirming old headlines or check the box, I know what's going on with transit, which can be easy to do. With that, I'd like to invite you into the first small group, which is simply to warm up the room and get to know who's here. We'll break you up into groups of approximately 3. Please share one at a time who you are, what your role is, and something you're hoping to learn today. This is just a 5-minute quick breakout.
And the breakout groups are open, so feel free to hop on in. If you wouldn't mind just sharing your role, your organization, and who you are in the chat with everyone, that would be great. And then Fran, if I could get the next slide. Awesome. So we're really excited for this conversation today. We have two great policy experts here to talk about the state of public transit in California. We have Laura Tolkoff, who's the Transportation Policy Director at SPUR, San Francisco Planning and Urban Research. And we also have Victor Flores, BART Director in District 7 for the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to kick us off. Thanks so much for being here with us, Laura.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here with you all and amongst so many people doing such interesting work around the state. So I am here to listen as well and learn from you. I will start off with just kind of a brief overview of what I'll be talking about, but also kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. So, really what I want you to take away are these four things. Public transit matters, funding is destiny, the fiscal cliff was completely foreseeable, and it is solvable. So that's what I'll be talking through today. But first, I think, I come to this actually as someone who really started my career in in the climate world, climate adaptation and climate resilience in particular, back east. So, my kind of first job out of grad school was working at an organization similar to SPUR out in New York, Regional Plan Association, and I was hired to work on energy and environmental issues. And then the first week of my job, Hurricane Sandy hit. And so I really come from that world, like many of you. And so the things that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to be probably a bit more candid and a bit more, uh, uh, yeah, just more candid than I would normally be, I think, and more conversational, because what I'm going to share with you are kind of the things I wish I had known sooner, much of which I've learned on the job and really learned in the last 6 years in particular. Um, I am not a civil engineer or an engineer of any type. I really am a policy person who is coming to this with an appreciation of how important transit is. Next slide, please. I actually, yeah, so just a little bit about SPUR. So SPUR is an urban policy organization that works to make the Bay Area more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous so that all people can thrive. The way we do that is through research, education, and advocacy. Our research is really applied research, focusing on issues that face the Bay Area and to some extent the state, and really making sure that we are bringing people together to identify policy solutions that are, worth fighting for. And so it really sets up the foundation of our advocacy work. Next slide, please. Um, we have been involved in a lot of transportation and transportation kind of adjacent issues in our 100+ year history. So on the left, you can really, well, in this slide, you can kind of see the spectrum of the types of work that we do related to transportation. On the left, you see a number of our reports that are very transportation specific, particularly around transit, around things like pricing, and but I also included a report around housing because we approach things from an intersectional way. So we really see all parts of the built environment as really deeply connected to each other. And so housing is just as important to transportation and how we think about it as our pricing, right? Um, we the middle strip here, this purple piece, talks a little bit of some of our work just in 2025 in terms of publishing reports and policy briefs and articles and advocacy letters, how many people we have reached through those materials as well as our voter guides, things like that. So it gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what we do and how you can engage with SPUR. We also put on public events all throughout the year. So both, if you could go back one, both digital and online. And on the right, you see some of the work that we do that is really more advocacy and action oriented. So even as early as 1973, we had been publishing research and advocating for San Francisco to establish a transit priority policy that really has been kind of the North Star that has guided much of the transportation policy in San Francisco. In 2010, we were working, actually leading a campaign called Fix Muni Now, and things are very much coming full circle. But really, we have worked on numerous campaigns to raise funding for transit, to do things like charter reform and other things that will make transit work better. And in the past few years, a big focus of my work has really focused on securing funding for transit in a post-COVID world. That has really been the focus of my work has really been the state budget and other sources of state funding. And what I'll talk about today towards the end is really what we're doing here in the Bay Area now to set ourselves up for a more financially sustainable future. Next slide. Um, and also feel free to use the chat and I will try and take a look and answer questions as they come. So feel free. So, I was a late bloomer when it comes to transportation and particularly public transit. But I have really cared about transit since I became a transit rider at 17, and really fell in love with cities. And, but there's really a ton of reasons why we should be caring about transit. And, I really believe that it is the scaffolding for all the things that we need and want in society. Next slide, please. So, when you invest in public transit, it is an investment in our climate. It is an investment in our health. It is an investment in better air quality, right? So in the Bay Area, we have almost 1 million trips taken by transit every day. That is even in a post-COVID environment, where people are riding less. And you can imagine what would happen if all of those trips suddenly had to take place on a car, in a car. So we know that it would be, really adding to our climate pollution. And of course, transportation is the biggest source of emissions in the state. So really an investment in transit is an investment towards reaching our climate goals and better health. Next slide. When you invest in transit, you are also investing in more affordable communities. So transit really helps move people more efficiently. It frees up space in cities. So instead of using space for parking lots or wider roads, it gives us the space that we need for what we need most, which is more homes. Um, you're probably very well aware that in the past few years, the state has approved a host of really powerful pieces of legislation, including SB 79, which I know this group was very involved in, and particularly Jordan led so much work around SB 79. But basically, the state has passed a package of laws over the past few years, really pinning its strategy to create more housing and more affordable housing around transit, high quality, frequent transit, which also means that, as we sit here on the precipice of some real financial challenges for transit, where operators are considering cutting 50 to 80% of their service, the bottom drops out of that strategy very, very quickly if we don't have transit. So, we know for a fact, of course, transit and housing are intertwined, but they are even more intertwined today than they were a decade ago for that reason. Next slide. We also know that when you invest in transit, it is really an investment in economic opportunity. It is an investment in people's mental health and their connections. So these are two testimonials. One of them was actually the top one is one of my interns this summer, who took Caltrain to his internship in San Francisco for $1 each way. And he said, there's no way I could get to my internship otherwise. And he really credits this internship with just getting accepted into his choice college. Um, you have a lot of people, Muni is super important to youth, especially now that we have free transit for youth. And very affordable transit for youth. It allows people to get around and visit their friends and socialize without having to rely on a car or rely on a parent, which I think is really important because it really helps people avoid loneliness, which we know is the root of quite a few mental health challenges. And so it's really important both for economic opportunity and our overall health and for people's ability to participate in society and find new opportunities and relationships. Next slide. We also know that when you invest in transit, life becomes more affordable. This is a bit of a busy slide, but basically what it is showing you, it's a capture from the Housing and Transportation Index that is showing you really what the cost burden is when you have to drive everywhere. So San Francisco, on the other side here, is the only county in the entire state where the average household car ownership is one or fewer cars. Everywhere else is 2 to 3 cars. Obviously, that adds a lot of expenses for households who have to fuel up, who have to have insurance, who have to maintain those vehicles. People are paying a lot more to just live their lives when they have to drive till they qualify and then drive everywhere after that. Right. So we know that when you invest in transit, you are really helping to bring down the cost of living for people. And it's really not, I feel like people don't think about it sometimes. Maybe their payments are automated, but it is the second biggest household cost for people in California. So it really is a big deal. I mean, people in Oakland spend $200 to $300 less per month because they can rely on transit. So it's a really big deal, especially in a context of where everything just is getting more expensive. Next slide. Okay. So I think, just to the next thing I wish I knew, is that there are 210 transit agencies in California. Um, I don't know if that number surprises other people, but it certainly surprised me. But so what, right? Next slide. Why does that number matter? Well, this is actually, that number is where we can start telling this story and understanding why funding is destiny. Okay. So really the reason we have 210 transit agencies, and that is a symptom of inadequate and fragmented state funding. So what this shows you, this progression of pie charts is basically showing you the share of transit operating expenses that come from federal, state, local sources or from fares. And, we just took a few years, but we did want to get one from before the pandemic and after. But basically, it's showing you that statewide, roughly half of all operating funds are generated, or actually more than that, are generated through local funds and fares. And even when you had a big infusion of funding from the feds that really came through the state, overall, the picture has not changed that much. The overall pie shrunk, but the general proportions are still the same, other than the fares, which has shrunk pretty significantly. The state funding really has not changed much. And so what that means is that the state is really a minor investor in transit operations, and it means that most of the funding for transit service or transit operations actually has to be generated locally. And when you start having to generate funding locally, then you have issues of wanting to control where that money goes and how it is spent, right? So that is a big reason why we have so many transit agencies, is because you can look in other cities or nations around the world, and they may have a few transit agencies, often a major one that is like state owned or partially state owned. And it's got a lot of state investment. And here, we are doing it really locally, county by county. And that is part of the reason why we have so many agencies. Next slide, please. So this is kind of showing the same thing, but with a spotlight in the Bay Area. So actually, in the Bay Area, more than 2/3 of our funds come from local funds and fares, which an important takeaway from this, but I'll reiterate it from another slide, you'll see it another way, is actually that so the 5 biggest transit agencies in the state are LA Metro, BART, Caltrain, Muni, and AC Transit. And those are the largest and most productive operators. And in the Bay Area, like you saw, 4 out of 5 of those are in the Bay Area. They actually get the least amount of funding from the state. So these are the ones with the highest ridership, but they get the least amount of subsidy from the state, which means that they have been primarily doing it on their own when it comes to operating costs. So that funding is really local, and I'll get to why that's really important later. Next slide. So where does all that money go? These 210 operators are not all the same. In fact, one of the biggest things that I want to stress upon people today is that no two transit agency is alike. They differ because they have a different ridership profile, a different service profile, and a very different mix of funding sources that really creates a different financial picture for each of them. And that makes things difficult in a number of ways. What's interesting is that when you look around and see the 210 transit operators across the state, really only about 10 of them carry the majority of the state's ridership. So you see a really long tail with really small numbers, but really it's a handful of them that are really delivering the vast majority of the state's trips, the vast majority of ridership, and therefore the vast majority of climate benefits. So it is those largest and most productive systems that are really kind of punching above their weight, or I think that's the idiom, to have an impact on climate emissions. Now, it doesn't mean that transit doesn't matter in other places. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But it does mean that we have to recognize that transit does different things in different places and different agencies mean different things when we're comparing them relative to our policy goals. Next slide. So this is, where does all that money go that we have for transit operations in the state? We actually don't have that much state money for transit operations, which I'll get to in a second. But what you see here is kind of another way of looking at what we saw before, which is that relative to other states with kind of peer systems and peer aspirations when it comes to our climate goals, California has historically underinvested in transit operations. So you can see here, we are pulling much lower, sometimes half as much as other states when it comes to operating funds that come from the state. And BART, which had the highest fare box recovery and was kind of seen as the shining star that has for a long time kind of bucked the trend of declining ridership, was able to pay for the vast majority of its operating expenses through things like fares and local funding. Less than 5% of their budget came from the state. And, that means is that they were largely self-sustaining, but that also put them in an extremely vulnerable position because once the pandemic hit and once the entire economic geography of the Bay Area started to shift and the way we work starts to shift, it was very dependent on riders and riders riding a lot. And so that is part of the reason why we are in the position that we are today in the Bay Area is because we have the least amount of state funding in terms of transit operations. And the funding model that we did have was very, very vulnerable to the types of changes we had. Next slide. So again, I think in terms of like why all of this matters, just a couple of takeaways again to remember is that really the state plays a very minor role in funding transit operations. Much of the work of transit funding is really local. And it means that and it also means that the state has really underinvested in our largest and most productive systems, which are the ones that tend to serve cities where we need it from spatial reasons and where they will have the biggest climate benefits. So something to think about, there's this mismatch about where the need is when it comes to our policy goals and where the money is actually going. It's also something that really makes it very difficult to develop political consensus on a statewide funding or policy strategy for transit. I think anyone here who has tried to pass anything in the legislature would know that it is very difficult to do so. Los Angeles, for instance, or Southern California has way more legislators than the San Francisco Bay Area. Our needs are really different. In the Bay Area, we're dealing with legacy systems, older systems that require a lot of maintenance. And we're trying to kind of maintain the system we have, whereas in LA, they're building out and they're expanding. And so that's just one example of the ways that our needs differ, and then it shows up in the votes. So it becomes very difficult to you cannot have a one size fits all approach. And I think, sometimes the legislature where these decisions get hashed out, it becomes very complicated and difficult to get consensus and have a proactive strategy because of the sheer number and differences among them. Okay, so number three, I know I'm going fast. I am sorry. California's transportation spending is not aligned with its climate goals. It's probably not the first time you've heard this. Next slide, please. But I'm going to kind of do a deep dive here on how transit is funded, or actually, really all of transportation in California is funded, and why it was pretty much inevitable that we would end up in a fiscal cliff. So thank you to CalBike for this slide, for this image. But basically, the state has a $21 billion or so transportation budget, strictly from state sources. So that does not include things like local measure RR. It's just state sources. So, and 71% of that, or about 15 billion, gets spent on state highway maintenance, fixing roads, fixing potholes, making sure that the rails are up and work and in the right places, right? All of those types of maintenance activities. 10% of it goes to highway expansion across the state. And about 18%, or 3.8 billion, goes towards transit and active transportation, with the caveat that that is typically the one that always gets cut when you have a deficit in the state. So, the vast majority of our funding in the state, generated for the state, is not going to public transit or active transportation. It is going to maintain our state roads and highways or to expand them, which means that the minority is going to these more climate-friendly projects. CalBike and NRDC have done a ton of work on this in recent years, that is very thorough. So definitely recommend you check those out if this is a topic of interest. Next slide, please. So let's just talk for a second about that $3.8 billion. Where does it go? Where does it come from and where does it go, basically? So this is kind of how it breaks down roughly. On the left, you have the local transportation fund, which comes from the state general sales tax. Quite frankly, that is generated in the counties, goes up to the state, and then comes back down. A lot of people actually just consider it local money, not state money. So it depends who you ask. The state likes to count it as state money. 670 million or so is from the diesel excise tax. You have $64 million for LC-TOP, which is a program in cap and trade that can fund some types of operations. You get the picture. This is basically how it breaks down in terms of transit funding. Next slide. The problem is it might seem like $3.8 billion is a lot, but the reality is every single source of this funding is declining, or it is capped, or it is cut. So you see on the top right here, $600 million for active transportation program. That's from the general fund. It's extremely volatile. It's usually one of the first things that gets cut in a deficit year. The other sources, all of which are variable based because they're tied to the gas tax, because they're tied to sales tax, or because they have been legislatively capped. Like the new cap and trade reauthorization basically caps the amount of money that you can have for transit, which also means that there's really, the value of it goes down over time. So we are in this context where it seems like there is a lot of money at the state level for transit. The reality is there isn't, and it is going down. Next. So the point that I was making earlier, this is another way of looking at it, but basically, the state does put in a lot of money on capital investments. They don't put in much money in transit operations, and it is really not commensurate with state goals. So we have these very ambitious goals for our climate and air pollution and all these things, which relies on reducing how much we drive, but we have lagged behind the national average in terms of how much we spend on transit operations. And next slide. And it is even more stark when we start looking at, like I said, those that are delivering the most riders and therefore the most climate benefits. So basically, what this graph is showing you is that California in red is performing or spending less on operations when you normalize this relative to the national average, and then even less in the Bay Area, and even less on those that are currently facing really severe fiscal challenges. Next slide. And why does operating money matter? Why am I spending so much time talking about operating expenses and operating dollars? Well, it's because operating costs basically and operating funds translates to how much service you can provide, and how much service you provide translates directly into ridership. There's correlation everywhere along the way between how much funding you have for transit operations, how much service you provide, and what that ridership looks like. And so that means that the more ridership you have, the better it is for your climate. And so it's why we are very, very focused right now on operating funding. Next slide. So just in summary, this is probably a good thing if you make space for this information later. The vast majority of transportation spending in the state goes towards highways, streets, and local roads. Really, a fraction is spent on transit. The state is really not in the business of funding transit operations in particular, leaving it up to local governments. And this is just a big mismatch between what we say we need to achieve our climate goals and how we are actually supporting that in the state through funding. Next slide. And this is the last bucket, I promise. So for transit funding is very, very complex. It is very, very constrained, and it is volatile. And it's this funding environment that really drives transit performance and kind of what we see from transit agencies and policy outcomes. And it is this kind of invisible handcuff that really shapes how you and I experience it as a rider. Next slide. So this is a slide that I made late last night to illustrate the very complicated financial plumbing that is transit funding. So you have funding that comes from the federal government, and some of it is distributed by formula. Some of it is discretionary, meaning kind of a competitive grant. And here's how those kind of flow down through MPOs into agencies. And then you have all these other state sources. Importantly, I want to say two things. One is most of these lines here are blue. That means that they're distributed by formula. Those formulas are typically based on population and sometimes on the revenue of the transit agencies, which means that places like Los Angeles, which, has a lot of population, but lower ridership, is going to get more of those funding sources than in the Bay Area. I sound like I'm trying to set up a fight with LA. That's not what I'm doing, but I'm just kind of illustrating to you that another way in which kind of the funding gets distributed, not to the places where it's delivering the most climate goals. So I'm going to talk, and then all the blue ones are formula, and the only state fund that really provides any level of operating support in a meaningful way is one. There's one. It's purple. And so everything else here is for capital. And most of it is not even for transit. Most of it is actually for state highways and local roads. So this is just to kind of illustrate just how complicated it is, how many rules there are, and that the color of money really matters. So just so when it comes to cap and trade, as I'll show here, just as an example, we know that cap and trade was just reauthorized. One of the programs, for instance, within it that can provide a little bit of transit operations is LCTOP. It's about $60 to $100 million a year. But you can only spend it if it is a brand new service or brand new program, and it is only available for 3 years. So you can do something like piloting a new pass, or like the Bay Pass or Clipper Start, both of which are supporting free, like universal transit and lower cost transit, respectively. But you can't use it indefinitely. And so it is very, very limited in that way. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides for time, but basically the next couple of slides are ways of showing other ways in which the types of funding sources that are available are extremely, extremely constrained. And so it makes a real difference to people when your free pass is no longer available because the funding dried up. Or it is why we have to raise so much money locally, because most of the money that's floating around from the feds and the state is not available for service, or maintenance, frankly. So the takeaways from this is really that MPOs and transit agencies might administer or spend a lot of money, but they really don't have a lot of discretion over that money. And I think that's something that, is really missed in the discourse around transit reform. And then, and they're just very, very rigid. And so it makes it very hard for transit agencies to be nimble and adaptive in the face of the types of changes that we've seen over the last few years. Next slide. I'm going to skip this because I think Victor is going to talk a lot about it, but basically I think there's a lot of factors in our built environment and our policy world that shape the demand for transit. And really very little in that has changed. And so it's a major reason why demand for transit has declined. And so when you can skip ahead a couple of slides to connect Bay Area, or actually right there, go back to the funeral. It's in this context of very complicated funding, very restricted funding, very little operating funding where it is needed most, that we find ourselves in a fiscal cliff. And when you think about all those things together, it's honestly no surprise, right? This was completely foreseeable. The details might have been hard to predict, like was it a pandemic or something, or a recession, but it was always coming. And the Bay Area, I think, is really the canary in the coal mine. And the other agencies across the state, those other 205, are really not far behind. So let us be a warning for everyone else. And it's in this context that, we are now working on a regional transit measure, which is known as Connect Bay Area. What we are solving for is the fact that we have very severe and ongoing financial deficits really starting next year that will cause the operators to have to cut significant amounts of service. So the deficits that they're facing are ranging from 10 to 42 to 45% of their operating budget, and that's going to translate to very severe service reduction. And these four agencies, as I mentioned, matter a lot because one, they carry 80% of all the trips in our state, in our region, 30% of all of them in the state, and they're particularly important for that reason to our economy and to our climate. Next slide. And to our housing strategy. Those four make up about 400 transit stations that are eligible places for density bonuses and all sorts of streamlining and other things. If we don't solve this problem, we're looking at 50% cuts on Muni, things like eliminating fare discounts and pass programs for youth and seniors. Next slide. We are looking at BART having to shut down 2 of its 5 lines, shuttering dozens of stations and ending weekend and night service. Next slide. Caltrain going back to pre-electrification days to going once per hour and cutting weekend service. And so you can start to see just how damaging this would be to all the things we started off talking about that we care about. So climate, housing, opportunity, etc. Next slide. Next slide. I'm gonna go, can you go to, keep going? Okay, so again, Connect Bay Area, this is a regional transportation ballot measure that many folks are working on here. And it is going to, next slide, it is in 5 counties, so Contra Costa, Alameda, Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Francisco. It will be a citizens initiative. The campaign is about to go enter the field to do signature gathering so that it can qualify for the ballot and be placed on the November 2026 ballot. The intention is to, it will fund transit operations for the 4 largest operators facing the fiscal cliff and provide a little bit of funding for a couple of their small bus operators, as well as for transformational programs that are going to help continue making improvements in safety, cleanliness, and the more seamless integration of services so they feel a little bit more like one system. Next slide. So this is something that has been worked through the legislature over the last 2 years to be coming to this point in time to be placed in front of the voters. SPUR is working very closely on it alongside many, many partners. And next slide, please. We are, sorry, excuse me. So I would encourage you to go to connectbayarea.com. That is the website for the measure. There is an official launch of the signature gathering coming up at the end of January. And you can go to this webpage to endorse it if your organization would like to endorse a measure and takes position on measures. Volunteer with the campaign, or otherwise spread the word about it. And so I'm going to put a couple of, after I'm done talking, I'll put a couple of links here to the website where if you are interested, you can find out how to get involved and help out. And again, another big thing you can do if your organization does so is to endorse the measure. So that is where I'm going to end. I know I took you for quite the ride there, and happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura, for that incredibly comprehensive presentation. Certainly not the rosiest picture of how we fund transit in California, but I think a very sobering look. I know that's a lot for folks to digest, but we are going to transition over to Victor Flores, director from BART District 7, to just give us an overview really of what's going on with BART, really the state's uh, uh, most one of the state's most prominent public transportation systems, to get a good sense of what's going on there. So Victor, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks. And Laura, thank you so much for that high level overview of the whole store. Deep overview at the state level. Hi, everyone. My name is Victor Flores. I'm the director for District 7 with the BART Board of Directors. So for those of you who don't know, BART is one of 3 publicly elected or has publicly elected governing bodies. So just like your city council, we get put on the regular ballot. And then we get elected for 4-year terms. So let's go to the next slide just to see the system, because I think that even if you live here or whether you have visited here, sometimes it can be a little hard to comprehend or to understand the scale just when you're writing the system from one place to another. And as we think about transit at the state level, I think it's helpful to use BART as one example of how COVID has changed our finances, but also how transit systems are an important tool for housing, land use, and reaching those environmental goals. So as you can see, we have 50 stations across 5 counties that travel across 131 miles of track. I think most people are surprised that we have 50 stations. I think usually they're like, oh, I thought we only had 10 or 15. No, it's 50. It's a lot. And right now, we currently provide about 4 million rides a month. So that's even, with pre-pandemic or the new pandemic ridership, which is way below pre-pandemic. So that's a lot of people who we're helping to get to where they need to go as safely and cleanly as possible. And we are working to get back to our pre-pandemic ridership, which was around 400,000 people or rides per weekday. Right now, we're just at a little bit under 50%. Next slide. BART is a key regional connector for our bus service partners. So even though we provide rail service, it's a whole ecosystem that's interconnected. 87% of regional transfer trips use BART. Bus service helps feeds those riders to us, and then we help provide that last leg to get them to where they need to go, usually to San Francisco or downtown Oakland, but also other growing job centers across the Bay Area. And so that means that our bus operators, who are our partners, their fiscal health is important to us. It's not just about BART, it's about all of us being able to work together to reach that financial sustainability. So just think about how if BART service is cut, then that means those regional connections, which we've worked so hard to align and synchronize schedules and services, those would get stopped. Those would have to be reworked. And not only BART would suffer, but also our regional bus partners would suffer as well. So Laura mentioned some of the transfer programs that are happening with Clipper 2.0. We're so glad we've been able to transition to that new system to have, for example, the transfer discount program. So if you go from BART to bus or bus to BART, you get a $2.50 discount off that fare, which means we're estimating about a $1,200 savings per year for riders, which is important, especially with the rising cost of living. But next slide. So here is the big thing. Laura talked about how we were really seen as one of the prime examples of how you can reach self-sustainability through fares. At our peak, we had about 71% of our operating budget came from fare revenue. And the problem is if you see our last normal year in fiscal year 19, that blue bar is the operating revenue that we self-generated. The gray bar was the financial assistance, which is about 95% of that is from our sales tax in San Francisco, Contra Costa, and Alameda that helped to create BART during the initial 1970s and is still around with us. So even though the pandemic has left us, the impacts are still with us. We're at about 50% on a good day of ridership, pre-pandemic ridership. And we've been doing everything that we could to bring back our customers. And you can see the impacts when we have our highest customer satisfaction rates in the last 10 years, when all of the metrics for our quarterly performance goals are all climbing up and either at or above the goals that we've set. But the problem is that riders just aren't coming back. The landscape, that geography of work-life balance has completely shifted. And there's really not a lot you can do, with the exception of either forcing people to go back to work on Monday morning and getting rid of all working from home, or doubling the amount of housing and jobs overnight, which is infeasible and unrealistic. So the reality is that we need to identify a new revenue source, whether it's a regional measure or whether it's something else, to make sure that we can continue running current service levels. And I'll talk a little bit about the trade-offs between cutting service and service levels and what those impacts actually have on our budget. So before we take a look at costs, I do want to just highlight just how much work BART has been doing to control costs, and also that disconnect in with some people, whether you're in the Bay Area or not, that discourse where people are saying, oh, just people are not going back to BART because it's not clean, it's not safe, whatever it is. Well, we've looked at the data, and 76% of our pre-pandemic unique Clipper users, they're all back in the system. The difference is, instead of using it 5 days or 5 weekdays a week, they're only using it once, twice, maybe 3 times instead. And you can tell because the fastest growing ridership markets for us are evenings and weekends. But when you compare weekend ridership pre-pandemic, which was around 150,000 or so versus 400,000 on a weekday, those gains aren't going to be sufficient to get us back to where we need to be. And even with inflation-based fare increases, which just started in January 1, to help us keep up with inflation, we're still only getting about 20 million out of the 350, 400 that we need just from that. So we have heard from folks that BART should become a lot more efficient and find more cost savings. And I just want to go to the next slide just to take a look at what we've been doing. So when people say BART should become more efficient, sometimes what they don't realize is that we're actually one of the most efficient at controlling our costs. Our operating cost has actually grown way below inflation, and it's growing at the slowest rate versus our peer agencies. One of the things that we did was reduce the train length. So before it used to be, 8 cars, now it's 6 cars. 8 cars have return on some of our busiest lines, and that saves on things like electricity, operators costs, things and maintenance, things of that nature. But we've also implemented pretty much all of the recommendations from our independent Office of Inspector General. We've got a new chief financial officer. All of those things are helping us to cut. We've also implemented hiring freezes. And we'll talk in the next slide, but even all of that, we've basically trimmed as much fat from the agency as we could. And here are some of the impacts from the last time we did cuts. If we can go on to the next slide. So what a lot of people don't know is that during the pandemic, we actually did cut a lot of staff because we weren't running service. So we reduced service while people were sheltering in place. We gave people, we allowed people or incentivized people to do early retirements. We cut folks that maybe had not passed their probationary status. We just cut wherever we could because we weren't sure when we would be back to normal. And one of the things that we found is that only about 40%, that purple bar, only about 40% scales with service. So what I mean by that is because of the high fixed cost of rail operations, which includes trains, tracks, stations, and other infrastructure that has to be maintained even to run, say, one train for the whole day, that you cannot change that. So because of this firsthand experience, we know that if you cut 1% of your total service, that does not result in 1% budget savings. To produce enough cost savings to cover our expected funding gap, that would require massive cuts like Laura just mentioned, right? Cutting lines, cutting stations, cutting weekend service, cutting evening service. And our initial forecasts indicate that cutting from our deficit from the budget would potentially require further budget cuts because that decrease in service levels would actually force people to look for alternative ways to get to where they need to go. So just to be clear, our forecast has us that if we reduce 65% of our service right now, we are estimating we would probably save maybe 20% of our costs, of our operating revenue. And if we cut 85%, we might be able to save 30% of our operating revenue. Or, we can cut 30% off the top of the budget. 30% is at about where we are, and 85%, you basically don't have BART service. Next slide. So what happens if we cut BART? What happens if there's no more BART service in the Bay Area? Well, even if you don't ride transit, the reality is BART benefits drivers just as much as the transit user because we are essentially a tool for reducing congestion as well as other things, more positive things. But we reduce congestion, we improve access to employment, we make sure that people have access to commercial activities and educational opportunities. But when we reduce traffic, that actually improves productivity and economic activity for everybody. BART riders who switch to driving would actually increase traffic on the Bay Bridge by about 73% and 22% on the Caldecott Tunnel. So that's the tunnel, one of the major connection points from Alameda County to Contra Costa. And we know this because of this past service disruptions we just had in the last couple months. So we actually took that data and saw how it impacted traffic on both of those routes. So the reality is the regional transit network just would not function without BART, which is the backbone of the transportation system in the Bay Area. It would cascade not just from us, but as I mentioned, to our bus operators and other operators that have connections to BART. And the Bay Area would increasingly become even more inequitable, and the disproportionate impact, because the disproportionate impact will be felt by transit-dependent and low-income riders, which have been increasingly becoming a greater portion of our rider profile. Next slide. So I want to keep this slide really simple because transit, let's just take a step back and think about what the purpose of transit is. It depends based on whatever city, geography, county you are at. BART, for example, and I put it simply, to me, transit is the purpose is to move people. It's simple, but it's not so simple. BART specifically was really designed to help get workers, office workers, 9 to 5, from the suburban areas into the central business districts. That was part of the original design, to reduce congestion from the Bay Bridge and other areas. So that is one of the reasons why BART exists. Every other agency will be a little bit different. But when you start talking about that purpose, you also have to start thinking about how your land use impacts it, because the reality is when you look at the impacts of our land use, that helps to determine just how many riders you're going to have. And we've done studies ever since the 1990s researching the impacts of trans-oriented development on BART. So for us, I'll talk about it a little bit in one of the next slides, but it helps our financial self-sustainability. Now, take that away. If you're just interested in environmental impacts, then the reality is more public transit riders means fewer car trips. And here are some of the stats that we have. Without BART, there would be a daily increase of miles driven. So we're talking about 780,000 to 1.5 million miles driven per day. So imagine 2,000, 4,000 cars from San Francisco to LA. That's how much more traffic there will be. If you want to look at gases, the gallons of gases burned, we're looking at 35,000 to 70,000. So if you want to, combat those impacts, you would have to plant about 5,000 to 10,000 tree seedlings to sequester some of that carbon for the next 10 years to help remove that.
Hey,
Next
Victor.
slide. Yeah.
Sorry, just gonna interrupt for a moment. I know there's more of the presentation, but we're running a little bit behind on time, and I want to make sure folks have a chance to ask some questions. So if it's cool with you, I know we have the TOD component as well. Maybe we can get into that a little bit during the Q&A.
Yeah.
If that
Why don't I
works.
just I think it'll be fine to end on these next two slides then.
Perfect.
Okay, next slide. So just BART TOD overview. We have about 250 acres of developable land. I think we went ahead a little bit. We're on TOD goals. TOD overview. There we go. So we have TOD at 27 stations. That's looking at 22 jurisdictions where we've been working with to help get that built, and about approximately 28,000 potential new homes that we're working on. So TOD, I cannot understate or overstate this enough. It really has the ability to transform areas if you do it correctly, and also support your transit agencies. And we've seen, I'll end on this. We've seen from our studies going back to the 90s that TOD residents are far more likely to use BART, specific because obviously they're BART studies, And one of the examples is Pleasant Hill. I don't know how many people think of Pleasant Hill as a big transit community, but when we studied the TOD that's happened there, 45% of the residents in a TOD building take transit. And then once you go outside of a 1 mile radius, I think it was 1 mile, only 8% of those residents use transit. So it's very clear that if you want more riders, you need to have more housing near transit. So I'll wrap up there. Happy to take questions. I think the other stuff was a little bit too wonky on the housing side, so that's perfectly fine.
Awesome. Thanks, Victor. All right. I know at least a couple people had questions here. So feel free to either raise hands or even better, just go ahead and put in the chat. One of the questions I saw earlier was around the cost. This Laura May, this goes more to you around the cost slash investment per mile calculation compared to effectiveness of state support and comparing that to highways. Curious if you I know you've been answering in the chat some of these too. But if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I don't think I've seen that calculation. I think it would also matter how you um, quantify effectiveness. But I do think NRDC in particular has been looking at the climate impacts and VMT impacts of on kind of a cost per mile basis. And so I'm going to try and find that report maybe and send it because I think it's got a lot of good research in there.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Does anyone else have questions? All right. Jeff, go ahead.
Well, so just to follow up on that other question, the reason it's important, obviously, is people think of transit subsidies as something that's added on and a tax and they're paying out of their pocket, and they tend not to benchmark those costs against what they pay for their automobile use and maintenance of highways and roads. And so I think, in terms of getting people to be more supportive, I think if you could sort of try and come up with sort of a measure of how much money are we investing in public money to maintain our highways and roads to get, a mile of passenger trip versus a mile of, trolley or bus. I think it would help to, I think, equalize that picture. We see it a lot with airport arguments versus subsidizing intercity rail, and there's also often a false comparison that's set up because people aren't factoring in all the costs. Anyway, I think it helped the sale on the initiative.
Thank you.
All right. I saw a question. This one's, I think, more for Victor. Victor answered it in the chat. So we can go ahead and folks if they want can look at that. I don't know, Victor, if you want to touch on that
Yeah.
more.
Yeah, I can share a little bit. For those who aren't familiar with rail plus property, the concept is essentially it's a policy decision where a transit agency decides to become a developer or co-investor in development around the stations. So the way that most jurisdictions, including BART, typically do it, or build TOD, if you want to call it that, is really we lease out the land that we own near or at our stations to a developer, and in exchange for that, we do mostly 99-year leases. We ask them to make sure they're building with union labor. We ask them that they work or set aside at least 15% for affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing. And usually depending on the station or the site, we might ask for a couple different capital improvements in exchange. So taking North Berkeley Station as an example, we're going to build almost 1,000 units there. About half of that will be subsidized affordable. I think we got some pedestrian and bike improvements. And then, but we don't own that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, 8 million a year in the lease revenue. Uh, I don't even think it's that much, honestly. But where we're expecting to get most of the money is from the increased ridership. But if you became a co-investor in the market rate units, then you're getting a portion of the monthly rent from that as well if you're using RoPolis property. That's how Japan's transit systems operate and Hong Kong's. So typically their operating revenue is one third from leases, one third from fares, and then one third from I'm forgetting the other component, but basically they're self-sustaining.
Awesome. Thanks, Victor. And with that, we're going to do our second round of breakouts. Fran, if you can advance the screen. Yeah, thanks. Just going to talk a little bit about what stood out most to you and what may have challenged or surprised you about what you learned today. So breakout rooms are open. Go forth. Ratna, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just a reminder to come back on camera if you can, please.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So for those of you who have been here before, you've probably done this, but we like to do just a quick debrief with folks and a report out of what everyone heard in their conversations, themes that were bubbling up. Folks can feel free to put stuff in the chat if you have thoughts, but I'm going to call on just a couple individuals to get just some quick reports. Michael, I saw that you came off mute. Do you want to share what your group discussed and what topics really bubbled to the surface there?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, Michael Abramson. If not, that's totally fine, and we can ask someone else.
We talked about opportunities to address this funding issue. And one idea was this structural change in how the existing funding is used, like spending less on highway extensions and more on public transit. And of course, this funding measure for Bay Area, it's very important. But maybe there are other options, like what we are doing in Mountain View, this for Measure P, it's tax for big businesses that if they require the employees to come on site, so maybe they could contribute somehow into the infrastructure that is needed for this. But for political reasons, this is not used widely. But
Gotcha.
in Mountain View, it passed, so maybe it's still doable. But anyway, sorry, I have to leave to another meeting. But
no problem. Thank you so much for sharing, Michael.
Thank you.
Alyssa, you look potentially eager to share. Would you mind reporting out?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Just a couple quick things. One or two.
We talked about kind of the breakdown of CapEx and OpEx and kind of how well it was laid out, but also talking about kind of how that hamstrings local agencies. And I just thought that was a great conversation.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Is there anyone else who would like to share out from their group before we all take off here?
Hi, this is Remy here.
Hey, Remy.
We talked a little bit about the headways on BART, that's challenging, and we went from 15 to 20 minutes, and that this reduces the incentive for ridership, plus the high cost of the fares, compared to other things, like EVs and that sort of things. So they got to get the incentive structure right and the cleanliness of BART. I mean, BART's got homeless on board. The trains are not clean. There've been recent crime issues, so they got to address that. The good news is, you know, I saw the housing, the tail end of the housing thing, and that was interesting. Is that's the way to increase riderships to develop over the sites. You know, they do that in Hong Kong, Singapore, and China, and they get incredibly high density on the site. So what they're doing in locally, sounds like, you know, they're on the right track, so to speak.
Cool. Thank you, Remy. All right, we are at time, and so I want to let everyone go, but just say thank you so much for joining us all today. This is obviously an incredibly important topic to both housers and environmentalists, and is going to have just a really outsized impact, both on the environment, the economy, and people's wallets. If you want to learn more about the Bay Area Regional Transportation Measure, as Laura was talking about earlier, the Connect Bay Area link is in the chat, and we'll send that out to everyone as well. We have a couple more learning series this year. Our next one will be next month, and you'll get some more information about that coming to you soon, about how and where California builds. But for the moment, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks
Take care,
so much.
everyone.
So nice to meet you all.